part of the reason why I wanted to come on the show with you is because you've reached the point where I feel a lot of us want to be. And like you said, you started off with one door. You started off exactly where we are. So I wanted to know like what your experience was like starting off as well.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Real Estate Investors Club podcast. I have with me today my returning guest, Stefanie, young investor who I first met at our networking events. And we're going to do a mini series that kind of charts Stefanie's journey into the world of investing from the motivations in the beginning to closing on a first property, and then what she and her partner did to kind of get over those first few weeks of ownership. So the episode today is really going to look at how do you go from an idea? How do you go from being motivated that real estate investing, you think it might be for you? How do you go from there to actually being ready to sign up for an offer? So Stefanie, just by way of introduction, do you want to give us a really quick, like 2 lines about who you are, what you do, and what your motivation is for wanting to do this mini series?
Okay. Hi. Well, thank you for having me back as a returning guest. I wanted to do this mini series for a few reasons. Well, I don't know, it's hard to summarize it in 2 lines, but I felt like there was a lot of emotions that came along with this journey, and I really wanted to highlight that. And I feel like a lot of the trainings that I've done and podcasts that I've listened to often highlight the actions that you need to take. And what I realize is that there's a lot of emotions that come along with it. And it's hard to navigate those emotions. And I think for a lot of the beginner investors that listen to your show, I wanted to create a sort of like a relatable reference for them and maybe provide some motivation that, like, if I can do it, anyone else can. And I used a lot of the tools that you had given us through the Real Estate Investors Networking event and this podcast. And I just want to say that it works if you follow along with it. So that's me.
Great. Okay. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start with, I guess your why, with how you came into the ecosystem in the first place. Like, what made you decide that you wanted to start investing, and then what happened?
It started a bit because, first of all, my grandfather was an immigrant from Italy, and he bought his building, which was a 4-plex, I believe, and he always collected rents. And that's just kind of the way my dad was brought up, and I saw a lot of that, and I saw the benefits of having those rental incomes, but I just never thought that I can get to that point. When I got my first full-time job after school, I saved up enough money to buy my condo, but my ideology back then was like pay it off as soon as possible. It was to invest and to rent it out, but it wasn't really to scale. It was more hold on to this, make a few bucks, and then like have more equity in it down the line. And then I had a bad experience with renting this condo that I'm in with subletting and the tenants, and I just didn't want anything to do with it. And it wasn't until I think less than a year ago that my partner Michael came to me and he was like, "Oh, I read Rich Dad Poor Dad. Like, can we get back into this? I think it'd be fun if we built up this real estate empire. Like, there's a lot of benefits to it." And I was like, "I want nothing to do with the tenants." And he's like, "Okay, I'll take care of that part. You take care of whatever you're good at, which is the admin stuff, background stuff, and keeping up the motivation side of things." So that's kind of how we got into it. And I read the book after he had recommended it, and we had like this frenzy of learning. I think it took a month of just reading books, watching YouTube videos, listening to podcasts. We were in deep, and like that's all we were thinking of. Well, I mean, we kind of slowed down after that. I think we got burnt out because all that information takes a toll on you. You have the motivation to get through it, but then at a certain point, it's just too much, and you kind of want to go back to just watching TV and hanging out with friends, and that kind of slowed us down a little bit. For at least a few months, we didn't think about real estate at all. But that's how we got started, this second phase of my journey in real estate.
So let's just, I want to get into that a little bit. So you have this motivation, and then the first thing you do is you kind of like pick the low hanging fruit, which is the free resources or the low cost resources of like books, YouTube, stuff you can do in your house that like doesn't involve, I would say, too much getting out of your comfort zone, right? Like if I think of like the things that would make me nervous, like if I have to actually get in my car, go to a networking event and like face real human beings, it's like way more anxiety provoking than like, let me buy a book and read this book, or like, let me watch this YouTube video to learn about something. So, I mean, I don't know, do you want to say, do you want to say something about that? Like why, it seems like the natural place to start there, but, what were the, the feelings associated with that? And then what made you transition from there to like maybe taking the next step on the exiting of the comfort zone?
Yeah, so the emotions were definitely feeling overwhelmed. Like, how are we ever going to get there? I was listening to, let's say, the guests on your podcast and feeling inspired by them and where they've gotten to in their journeys. But then oftentimes I was asking myself, like, how will I ever get there? And just feeling discouraged. And I think you just have to, well, what I did, I brought it back to my why. And I know that's so cliche. Everyone talks about what are your whys. But what I really wanted was to get to a point where I don't have to rely on my full-time job. Like I want to be financially free, but not to just sit back passively on my yacht and enjoy the passive income from rents and stuff. I just want to be able to choose what I do with my life. And I actually was talking to a friend, and she told me that her mom was diagnosed with leukemia. And 2 weeks prior, I was talking to my friend's mom, and she was talking about how excited she was that she was retiring in the next few months. And I was like, wow, that's hard. You work your whole life and then you get diagnosed with this life-threatening cancer. And like, I don't want to get to that point. I want to take control of that. So after I got discouraged from just, I don't know, all those doubts in your head and saying that you can't do it, I think, like, I know it's going to pay off in the long run. And that's what I try to focus on all the time, is just, why am I doing this? And just a lot of self-talk. It's very repetitive. There's that emotional roller coaster of being super excited and motivated, and then one thing, like in a snap, just brings you down and you think you can't do it anymore. Like, that's too hard, or I don't want to fail. Like, there's the fear of failing too. Like, it's hard to get started. Sorry, I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think yes, indirectly, like, so my question was, as far as like the feelings at that stage of the journey, which, and one of the things that you pointed out that I think is a really good point for all of us who, in the mentoring space and the coaching space, who are trying to make it easy for people like you to, start out, is that having very advanced people on the show, people who are like at the top of top of the industry, top of their game, like, it's inspiring, but it can also have the opposite effect of being a little bit intimidating and kind of like, shutting people down, or giving you the feeling like, how will I ever get there? Like, if I don't get to 100 doors, if I don't have 1,000 doors, like, is my experience really worthwhile? And is it worth it for me to do this? So, I think that's, in terms of the motivation behind doing this series, I think that's a great motivation. And I think it's also a very real part of the journey that, like, if you're sitting there at the beginning and, like me, as somebody who facilitates the networking events, like, I see that. I see, like, when people first come into the room, very often, like, they're like, oh, like, I'm just here to meet people. Like, I'm not really an investor. I just have like one condo, or like, like it's almost like they're projecting, like, I'm ashamed to be here, or I don't belong here. And I
Yeah.
think that, if there's a way to help people along that journey, the first thing is that, like, in jiu-jitsu, we say, like, everybody starts out as a white belt. So, like, everybody who's wearing a black belt in the room, everybody who has 100 doors, 1,000 doors, whatever it is, we all started with the first door. We all started in exactly the position that you were, where we knew nothing. we read Rich Dad Poor Dad. There weren't podcasts back in the day, but so like, you know, in my case, I shook hands with some slimy agents and like had some conversations with people who actually didn't know what they were talking about. But that there's always like those first steps that you take on your journey when you don't know a whole lot, and that's almost like the facing down the imposter syndrome is almost the most difficult thing.
Right.
So
I was
did
just
you have
going to
anything to say? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that that's part of the reason why I wanted to come on the show with you, is because you've reached the point where I feel a lot of us want to be. And like you said, you started off with one door. You started off exactly where we are. So I wanted to know like what your experience was like starting off as well. Like, did you also feel these feelings of doubt? And like, I know your story we had spoken about in previous podcasts, but like, what were the emotions that you were facing when you first started? Did you think that you would be able to do it, or what was that like for you?
I mean, I think for me, the whole thing was just a lot less intentional, because it's like I didn't really set out to be an investor, you know, like I started managing property because I was managing the student home that I was in. I knew I liked that model. When I moved to Vancouver, I wanted to live in that kind of environment, but it didn't exist. So I'm like, okay, let me rent a house and create it. And then after that, I'd already been basically running the business model that I wanted to run when I came back to Montreal, and I'm like, no, I want to like continue to live in this environment, but I also read Rich Dad Poor Dad. So like I kind of already came into it a little bit knowing what I was doing. Like it's not like I started out from zero and was like, okay, I want to start investing. It's like I kind of fell into real estate. And I would say for me, the imposter syndrome was further down the road. Like
Okay.
I kind of, you know, unconsciously built my empire to like 9 doors with my 3 triplexes in Hochelaga, which I was running like student housing. And then I'm like, okay, now this is what I want to do. I don't want to be an academic. I don't want to be a prof. I finished my PhD. I don't want to do this with my life. I want to be a real estate investor. And
Okay.
then like, woof, all the weight of that falls on you, because you're like, okay, well, like this is not just something I'm doing as a sideline. This is not just like a lifestyle business that I'm running because I can. It's like, no, now this has to become a real thing. And like, so for me, like that was when the imposter syndrome kicked in. And I feel like I did exactly what you should not do, which is that I like hid from it for like 10 years. And so like I stayed with my 9 doors basically for 10 years time until I started, you know, attending the Real Estate Investors Club meeting and getting involved with other investors. And it was really through networking that I began to see, okay, what are those incremental steps that I can take to really grow as an investor? And so I'm going to kick it back to you, Stefanie. Why don't you tell me a little bit what that was like? Because then you go from like the YouTube podcast book phase and you're like, okay, let's now go to some networking events. Let's maybe put down some money for some classes. So tell me, what was that next step like? Have you really been listening to the episode, or has your monkey mind been taking you off in one direction or another? Our mental habits can be our biggest assets or our biggest liabilities as we pursue certain goals. For me, the biggest performance gains have always come from training my mind. In my book, Mindful Landlord, I talk about how you can train your mind and how you can apply some of these strategies to your journey in the real estate field. The book is available on Amazon and also on its website, mindfullandlord.com. And now I'll stop evangelizing for the power of mental training and let you get back to the show.
Yeah. So that next step was still like uncertainty. Like, do we want to go to the networking events? Being intimidated by the potential of it only being seasoned investors. And I just thought to myself, I was like, why am I holding back? Like, even if they are seasoned, they have a ton of information to share with me. And it also helped that I was going with a partner, Michael, my partner. If there's any advice that I can give to your listeners, it's like, find someone who you can go to these events with. I feel like it's comforting to have someone there that you know. And so going back to our first networking event, we were actually taking a kickboxing class at the time, and it landed on the same night. And we're like, okay, do we really want to spend or lose our money on the kickboxing class and then spend the money for the tickets to the networking event? I was like, it's going to pay off in the long run. Let's miss this class. We can always take more in the future. And we just need to be consistent with it and make a name for ourselves and just have people remember us. And since that date, like we've gone to every networking event that there's been, on every monthly networking event that there's been. And what I've noticed is that there are a lot of beginners. Like there's a lot of people that are exactly in the same boat as me. And even after like my third event, I almost felt like I was one of the seasoned ones. Like I wasn't nervous to be there anymore. It's still intimidating to go up to people. There was one event where Michael wasn't there, so I was kind of going solo, and it's intimidating to go up to people and be like, hey, my name's Stefanie. I'm new at this. Like, where are you at in your journey? And almost everyone I ran into were like, they were just a few steps ahead of me or a few steps behind me. And it's comforting to know that those people attended those events as well. And that also encouraged me to go back because there's such a variety of people that you meet, and it wasn't as intimidating after the first few times. But what really encouraged me at the beginning was I'm missing out by not going, and that I really, if I was serious about it, I needed to make a name for myself, and I needed to be recognized by being consistent and taking it seriously.
Mm-hmm. I think that the consistency is a great point too. Like for sure, the first event you go to, like you said, making a name for yourself. Like, how do you, as somebody inexperienced, become a known entity in that network? Because that's ultimately what you're trying to do. Like, it's not true that you go to one networking event, chit chat with people for 15 minutes, never go back, and expect to have some results. Like, you have to be consistent about it. You have to keep going back and then, follow up on some of the connections you make, which you guys did very well, like with me, for example. But like, following up that once you leave the room, whatever business cards or like social connections you make, don't let those leads go cold. So, and just by being in the room, because I think, like, as you describe effectively, like, your comfort level will go up any of the additional times that you go, and it gets easier to, like, present yourself, to be in the room, and then you kind of adapt yourself to that, and it gets easier.
Yeah.
Do you have like a specific advice as far as, like, I think for the one thing of like also going with a friend, maybe I would go so far as even to say one friend, but not two, because if you attend networking events with like a clique of people, the temptation is it then turns into like, let me hang out with my clique of 4 or 5 people and like not really mix. Whereas like if you're two, you're not going to spend like 2 or 3 hours just in a corner with that same person. So like, bring your blankie, but don't bring your blankie and like 5 stuffies, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's funny that you say that, like, only go with one person. We almost did like a tag team. We would kind of divide and conquer. Like, we'd tackle different groups and we'd get back together after half an hour and be like, oh, I spoke to that person. I spoke to that person. Like, what did you learn? And I was like, okay, like, we came here, and sorry, something else I forgot to mention is I would be prepared before going to the networking events based on where we were in our journey. So I would like talk to Michael. I was like, okay, do we talk about this? Do we talk about this? Like, these are the 3 reasons why we came tonight. This is what we need to tackle for the next steps in our journey. And we need to find out information on this. So I feel like you could also cover a lot more ground with the second person there. And yeah, it was fun. And something else that about networking events now is that they're fun. Like, you make friends. I've made so many friends there that I've even hung out with them outside talking about real estate. And I think an important part, which I've heard a lot too, is to surround yourself by people who think similarly. And that's definitely helped me a lot, is like outside of those events, is to continue talking about real estate with the friends that I've made there. And they've definitely come in handy when I've needed them, to just give them a call or gotten together because, I don't know, we had a question. And
yeah, I'm reminded of, I think it was at the last event, Michael put up his hand and was like, how do I deal with the fact that when I come out with, my investment plans, my family or like my peer group suddenly starts poking holes in my ideas and have all these reasons why I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing. And precisely, like, instead of, not only necessarily building team members or finding mentors or doing all of those like sort of like high value things that people think about when they go, attend networking events, like just building a peer group of people that you can talk to about what it is, people who are even at the same level as you. Like, it's going to help you feel less like an imposter, and help you, have a resource where you can have those conversations, where maybe you don't have to lay it out at dinner with your your family or your friends who are a little bit more risk averse.
Yeah, it's true. And going back to this concept of it being an emotional roller coaster, it's exactly that, because going to those networking events brings me up every single time, and I leave feeling so motivated and ready to conquer the world. And then I go to my family dinners and people are questioning what we're doing, and they're like, oh yeah, that doesn't work. Why would you have multiple tenants? Like, you don't have time for that. They just bring you down, and then your confidence gets shot, and then you start doubting yourself too. So that's another benefit of going to the networking events, is definitely to bring you back up when you're not able to yourself.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, and I think also, like, in terms of those rooms, like, very often it's a select room in terms of people who've gone through personal journeys and like personal transformations, right? And so, like, even if they're people who like have one condo or nothing whatsoever, everybody who's in the room had to get over the comfort zone thing of like, let me show up to a networking event, let me shake some hands. And so there is an energy about that of like people who actually go out of their way to be like, let me do this thing that's going to help me develop as a person, as opposed to, just going out for coffee or sitting with Netflix, or like, having dinners with people that you've sat in front of for the last 10 years, right? Like that, just that in itself. And then, so I don't want to, go too far in this. I think we kind of went through, just the starting out phase, the getting over the first hurdle of how you move out of your comfort zone, which is to get, into the networking space. You also mentioned, I think one thing that I want to pull out a little bit is the fact of going there like intentionally. So if you go there with a goal, which is like, let's say I have these 3 questions that I want answers to, or I have these 3 things that I want to do. It structures the conversations you're going to have, and it structures what you're doing in the sense that it's kind of like you're not going to the high school dance, or it's not a popularity contest. Like, you're not going there to just randomly shake hands with people and like try to make connections. You're going there with an intentional, this is what I want to come away with in terms of information or something like that. So I think that's for our listeners who are thinking about how to structure those first networking things. I think that's a effective way to do it. And then if we move this to kind of the next phase of the journey, and I don't want to give all of that away, but maybe we can just sort of like prime it for the next episode. What was the next step that you felt like you took after just simply being in the room?
Yeah. So like I said, we started off with a lot of the free or very cheap resources out there. The next step was to go to our first paid event that was $200. And for me, that's a lot of money. I know there's a lot of trainings out there that are thousands, but baby steps, 200 was a lot for us. And that taught us a lot as well. We definitely were disappointed by parts of it, and we can get into that later. But that was the next step, was the paid event, and also starting to build our team of people that we would need to get this process started.
Okay. Well, Stefanie, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first episode of the mini series. Let's leave the team building and the first paid event for episode 2. And I want to just, thank you for taking the time to share your experience with the audience and to be that voice of the inexperienced investor who will take people through the first maybe 3, 4, 5 steps on the journey to demystify it and to make it just more accessible as a voice, a data point. So thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Hopefully I help at least one person.
Great. Thanks, Stefanie.
Thanks.